I think it's been the convergence of so many different threads that all just met at the precise catastrophic moment that gave rise to, I think, the most harmful concept psychiatry has ever come up with, which is the concept of the transgender child. I think there can be no possible more destructive concept ever unleashed by psychiatry than...
Yeah, we lost a lot when we call it gender nonconformity, or, gender, you know what I mean, these gender dysphoric children. We lost a lot when we allowed that to be called. It took a leap to the transgender child. I didn't notice it happening, but it was something that was kind of, certainly that's what, made me start speaking up. I was like, what is this concept? Why are they talking about it? This is crazy.
And it's so obviously false as well, which is why you have to consider all of the different factors that led us to this place, because it's really insane that we, in about 2005, 2006, we all suddenly started to believe that there were transgender children and that you could be a transgender child. There's a lot of cultural and political influence that went into a whole society losing its mind and believing something so insane, I think.
So hello, Mia. This is an unusual podcast for us. I think is it our first, just the two of us, and it's something kind of close to my heart, because ever since really I've been working, like from 2017 onwards, I've been talking about gender dysphoria and trans issues. And you'd often get people in the comments saying, there's no such thing as gender dysphoria, there's no such thing as gender. Why are you talking about gender dysphoria? And it is disconcerting, because I'm like, okay, of course you could say there's no such thing as gender dysphoria, there's no such thing as gender, there's no such thing as depression. But what does that mean? Like, where are we going with such a nihilistic attitude to, there's almost no such thing to it as anything that isn't actually physically tangible. These are concepts. And so I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation where we spoke about this, in the larger sense of the word. So what do you think?
I think it's a great idea for a conversation. We did originally, when we had this plan, we thought we disagreed on more than we do, or perhaps we disagree. We're going to have the conversation and see where we agree, where we disagree. Your experience definitely kind of conflicts with the preconceived ideas I had, or the not very well thought out ideas I had about the childhood onset side of this. But I think, it's a really important discussion to be had. Why don't we, I thought we would start, I could give a quick history of how the diagnosis of childhood onset gender dysphoria came to be, because that's actually, I think that's a fascinating story in and of itself, and then we can take it from there, whether it's real or not, or beneficial or not.
We could track it.
Right. So it made it, the diagnosis appeared in DSM-3, like so many others. DSM-3 was the DSM-3 revolution, basically. Robert Spitzer took on the task force for DSM-3, and he wanted to revolutionize all of psychiatry. And so DSM-2...
And this is 1980, is it?
Published in 1980. So it was occurring in the early 70s was when they first commissioned Robert Spitzer to lead the DSM-3 task force, and then he has these grand ideas. Prior to that, DSM-2, it was a smaller document, and it was far less, it wasn't this all focused on symptoms. There were, I can't remember, it's been a while since I read the history, but there was an explosion of diagnoses from DSM-2 to DSM-3, and he was trying to bring order to psychiatry. I think there was some reason to what he was doing. It made some sense, but it was
And who is he, for people who don't know? Just give a little bit of background about
Robert Spitzer. He was, he was a very prominent psychiatrist. I should have brushed up on my history. I don't remember where they pulled him from. It wasn't Johns Hopkins, I don't think, but he was a very prominent psychiatrist. But he had this. So there were two schools of thought. There were the what's behind the symptom, the really getting
I
in.
just looked up. He was from Columbia University in New York City.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
He
Keep going.
Yeah, so there were the kind of the traditional, to help someone, you've really got to figure out what's going on in their life, what's behind the symptoms, dig in and really do the work and find out what's causing this person to suffer from such distress. And then there was Spitzer and his gang, who wanted to just medicalize it and create diagnostic categories with very clear sets of symptoms that a person had to meet. And then it would be much easier for the insurance companies to have billing codes. It was a huge revolution. And DSM-3 brought many crazy diagnoses. I mean, transsexualism, before that, the diagnosis was transvestic fetishism or something. It was sexual deviancy. And then we get transsexualism for the adults. We get gender identity disorder of childhood for children. Multiple personality disorder appears in DSM-3, borderline personality disorder, all kinds of, many that we're familiar with, some that are quite controversial, appear in 1918. But I think the most fascinating one is gender dysphoria of childhood. I do, because the history of it came about because, okay, you've got 1950, 52, 53, it's Christine Jorgensen. This guy, he went to Denmark, he was an American, a homosexual man, could not accept his homosexuality, went to Denmark, underwent rudimentary sex change procedures, hormones and some kind of surgery, comes back and he's on the cover of newspapers and he's a blonde beauty, and it's this enormous sensational story, and it triggers the first social contagion, or it triggers the first wave, like a deluge of men showing up at sexologist and psychiatrist clinics begging for these procedures. Now, they didn't know anything really. They knew very little about who these men were at the time, but we can probably safely say now that the majority were autogynephilic men, which was decades away from being described. And gender nonconforming homosexual men like Jorgensen himself, probably with some level of internalized homophobia, wishing to escape their homosexuality. Those would be the two groups. But the majority of them showed up in the 1950s, 1960s. The majority of them showed up telling stories of lifelong femininity. Like, I always knew that I was female. I always knew that I was female on the inside. Even when I was a child, I was very effeminate. I liked all the girly things. And so the researchers, we're talking John Money, Richard Green, Robert Stoller, they decide to turn their attention to effeminate boys, a group that had probably always existed, I'm sure had always existed in society, but it was never pathologized, and they were never a research interest until these men start showing up saying that they'd always been feminine. That's what triggered the interest. They started researching these boys. They were doing prospective studies. So they take groups of effeminate boys and they're looking for transsexual children. So they follow them for like 20 years to see how many of them grow up to be transsexual adults. And the reason that they did this was to prevent adult transsexuality. At the time, it was not considered to be a positive outcome. It was considered to be undesirable and something that you wanted to prevent. But it gets even darker when, at the end of those 20 years, what they ended up with was a whole bunch of gay men. They hadn't found transsexual children. They had found pre-gay boys. Like they were boys who were destined to grow up to be gay. Now, there's two parts to this that I find majorly disturbing. On the one hand, look who triggered it. All of those men, after Jorgensen came out, flooding the clinics, begging for the sex change surgeries, they would mostly have been autogynephilic men. desperate to fulfill their paraphilic desires. And they were lying.
Do you have data on that? Like, or is that a hunch? Like, Christine Jorgensen, might they have, some of them been feminine homosexuals?
I think some of them would have been, but just knowing what we know about the makeup of all these men who seek hormones and surgeries, we just know that most of them are autogynephilic men. That has always been a strong disproportionate ratio. Heterosexual autogynephilic men have always made up the bulk. So we can just safely assume, and there's another clue, and that is that the researchers, they'd already started studying effeminate boys. They already had the project, the prospective study on the go. And then they start to realize, I think these men are lying. They all sound like they're reading from a script. And they came to the conclusion that they were coaching each other. It's like pre-internet Reddit. God only knows how they were doing it. But even in the 1950s, 60s, they were coaching each other what to say to get the drugs and the surgeries that you so desperately desire.
And could I interject? For myself and Sasha interviewed Anne Lawrence. Anne Lawrence is a male to female transsexual, transitioned, many years ago, is 70 odd now. And he said something along the lines of, I don't know, in the 70s and 80s, there was all sorts of networks. You went into the city, you went to the kind of edgy places, very much the gay, lesbian places, and there was networks, and you did exchange information. There was all sorts of information, zines, magazines and stuff like that. They were sharing information really from way back, like in the 1930s, 1940s. They were sharing edgy, subversive information on all sorts of things, and one of them was trans.
Yeah, that's precisely it. So the researchers figured that out pretty quickly, just like therapists today will say. It's like these kids are reading from a script. They all say the same thing. They're coaching each other on Reddit. These guys were doing the same thing. But I want to make clear the point that I'm trying to make is that it is very likely that a whole bunch of autogynephilic men who were lying and saying that they were effeminate boys to get hormones and surgeries is what triggered researchers to study actual effeminate boys who were destined to grow up to be gay. And that is the origin of the transgender child. That when they pathologized effeminate boys looking for transsexual children, that's the origin of the transgender child. But the other dark element, okay, go.
Could I interject one? You might be about to say it, but I think it's important to note. In the 1980s, Dutch clinicians noticed that an awful lot of trans people weren't having satisfying lives. And their crazy kind of upshot of this was maybe these men need to be, because it was mostly men at the time, maybe these men need to transition earlier because they would pass if they didn't go into puberty. And so their concept moved on into the 90s and noughties of we need to catch them before puberty. Hence, again, another kind of block towards the transgender child.
It's the threads, that's the thing. The origin, I would say, is these some were probably actually homosexual, but the autogynephilic men lying and saying they were effeminate, trying to get the hormones, that's when it was first pathologized. And then, the Dutch, our experiment failed on these men, so let's do it to kids. That's when the idea to medicalize these kids who had been pathologized in the 1960s, that's when the idea to medicalize them came along. But for me, what's upsetting and what shows that no part of, to me, not psychiatry nor gender medicine specifically is guided by evidence and science is the fact that when, let's say Richard Green's famous Sissy Boy study, that's published, I think, in 1987. It's 20 years. They followed all these boys. They're not trans. They're mostly gay. At that point, they should have said, okay, we got it wrong. There's no such thing as a transgender child or transsexual child. But they didn't, because the idea had escaped. And the idea had escaped, and it was the political movement, I think, seized upon it, because there's another thread going on at the same time. And that is around after Paul McHugh, Dr. Paul McHugh at Johns Hopkins, after he shut down John Money's gender clinic in 1979, then the modern trans rights movement really starts to form, and they're really like.
And give just for people who don't know, give a little bit of what Paul McHugh did, because he was really quite forensic. John Money was just really pushing trans in Johns Hopkins in the 1970s. He was a psychiatrist, was he? John Money? I don't remember.
Ooh, I don't know.
I'll check.
Sexologist, psychiatrist. Okay.
Maybe an endocrinologist. I'll check. But Paul McHugh definitely. Could you just give the listeners just what he did in the 1970s?
Yeah, well, he did what we need to do now. It needs to be done again. He came along, and this clinic is running, and they're doing this to all these men, and he just said, okay, well, let's see how they're all doing. Let's follow up this incredible concept in gender medicine that baffles anyone. They're like, what, follow up? What's that? So he did follow up. Let's look at what the lives of all of these men that you've done this to and see how they're doing. So they did, and they found that the men mostly said they were happy. This is a recurrent theme all along. The men mostly said they were happy, but nothing had improved about their life situation. They were not thriving, and they did not appear to be psychologically balanced or healthy. And so he just
and I looked up John Money. He's a psychologist. By objective measures. So they might say, I'm living my best life.
Yeah.
This self-report thing is so dangerous. I'm living my best life. I'm happy. It's the best thing I ever did. Was a sex change back in the 1970s. And then the objective measures, along with depression, anxiety, homelessness, hospitalization, psychiatric admissions into hospital, all of that, they were not doing well. This was not a good medical intervention.
Precisely. I mean, and like Paul McHugh, I wish I could quote him precisely, but it's something like he said, we decided we were colluding with a mental illness rather than trying to help the patients, and therefore it was a waste of medical resources, and he chose to shut down the clinic. That was the 1979 pivotal moment. I will say that the Dutch, when they followed up in 1988, it was the exact same thing. They followed up the men who said they were happy, but nothing about their life suggested that anything had improved. It's a recurrent theme that goes all the way through gender medicine. But then back to the children. So the trans, because he shut them down, and trans activists, then it goes almost into militant activism. They are hardcore. They want the medical treatment, and that is now the beginning of modern trans activism as we know it. And the focus is getting medical treatment. So the focus becomes access to medical treatment at this point in the 1980s, but also a key part of that whole focus and the rights movement to come is redefining being transgender as perfectly natural, healthy, innate, definitely not sexual deviancy, definitely not a paraphilia, and not even a mental illness. They decide to reinvent themselves as perfectly healthy and mentally balanced. And the concept of the transgender child fits perfectly with that. They take this concept that has been, stewing since the 1960s, and then the Dutch have got something going on as well. And it's perfect for trans activism, because if there are transgender children, then it's not a paraphilia. If there are children, and if it's innate, you actually need transgender children because you're born this way. And if you're born this way, then there have to be transgender children. So this concept that never had any evidence for it, and probably could have been seen to be quite catastrophic and dangerous, takes on a life of its own, or trans activism bring it really into existence, and they place it front and center in their own rights movement. And I think even to this day, they need it. They desperately need the concept of the transgender child. So all of that's going on, and that's while at the same time we get this official diagnosis in 1980 of childhood onset gender dysphoria, which I think gives validity to the concept of the transgender child, even though it's not saying that these are transgender children. As far as I know, it's not like the adult and adolescent, in that it's not saying at that point that these are transgender children, but it does give validity.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I want to think about that, but I want to just rest on one point because I've met so many, people who've medically transitioned, and I can see just from a psychological level how, if you've gone through medical transition and you've absolutely devastated your body physically, and you've also put a huge burden on your mind. I can see how you would convince yourself, just like people convince themselves of things all the time. I had to move, to Alaska. It was my only choice. I had to leave my husband. It was my only choice. I had to do this. I had to do that. That's what humans do. And we convince ourselves of things for these reasons. And so I could see how these trans women or even trans men at the time might have said, no, it was always in me. It was my fate. That's the way people talk. It was meant to be. You know what I mean? So I can see you're saying this political movement and they were there, they're manipulating and stuff. I would say they were also kidding themselves. I would say there were huge amounts that were just kidding themselves.
Oh, I don't doubt it for a moment. And even the autogynephilic men who to this day, they will claim, even in the modern day, that they were effeminate children. When you can be quite sure that they were not. I don't think that they're lying. I do think it's self-deception, because we do rewrite our pasts all the time to suit the person we are now and to make our past fit with how we like to see ourselves. So it's not. I'm not really applying evil motives, by the way, to any individual or even any group along the way. I think it's been the convergence of so many different threads that all just met at the precise catastrophic moment that gave rise to, I think, the most harmful concept psychiatry has ever come up with, which is the concept of the transgender child. I think there can be no possible more destructive concept ever unleashed by psychiatry than this. And it's so obviously false as well, which is why you have to consider all of the different factors that led us to this place, because it's really insane that we, in about 2005, 2006, we all suddenly started to believe that there were transgender children and that you could be a transgender child. There's a lot of cultural and political influence that went into a whole society losing its mind and believing something so insane, I think. And that's important to consider when you're talking about this topic.
Yeah, we lost a lot when we call it gender nonconformity, or gender, what I mean, these gender dysphoric children. We lost a lot when we allowed that to be called. It took a leap to the transgender child. I didn't notice it happening, but it was something that was kind of, certainly that's what made me start speaking up. I was like, what is this concept? Why are they talking about it? This is crazy. But I wish we had a better, I thought tomboy was a great word. I wish we'd had a better word for the boys. They never got a word. They never got a good word. People come up with crappy words, but they never got a good. I was proud to be a tomboy. A tomboy was a cool name. Tom. It wasn't Amy boy. You know what I mean? It wasn't Sally boy. It wasn't a girl's name. People come up with these crazy names, and it's like, no, you have to. These boys have to be, for example, an Amy girl or a Mary girl. Do you know what I mean? For it to work for them. I was a tomboy. There's no girl in that word. And therefore, I was really leading into it. I was very comfortable with it. And it was a gorgeous concept. And tomboys have a lovely history. Lisa Saladatis did a great book around it. Now she kind of, she lost a bit around trans, but it was a lovely book around the history of tomboys. And they had a heyday around when I was young, 1970s, 1980s. It was the kind of heyday of the tomboys. So lucky me.
I know, we were almost there. We were doing rather well. Although there is that it is
the boys
just, yeah, exactly. For some reason, it's just harder for society to accept a gender non-conforming boy and man, probably. I don't know.
And I think there's a reason for that. I think it's homophobia. I think,
Yeah.
if you look at the stats would bear me up that if you're a gender non-conforming girl, as in if you're a tomboy, yeah, you could well be a lesbian, but statistically, it's not a slam dunk. You might be a tom and grow up to be a lesbian, but you might not. If you're a feminine boy, if you're a sissy boy, if you're whatever the word is, the likelihood, as far as I can see, statistically, you're very, very highly likely to come to end up being gay. So I think it was homophobia, and I think it was an instinctive homophobia that adults knew. And so they did not like it in boys. While with girls, lesbianism wasn't really recognized, it wasn't really noted, while they did know about gay men, definitely, in society. And as well as that, it was an intuitive sense of they're going to be gay and we need to knock this out of them. That's my strong feeling that this is a homophobic instinct in society.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that does make sense. But even, do you think that kids are more accepting of tomboys than they are effeminate little boys? Because kids can be mean, and I think we might disagree on this. I think I was trying to remember what we disagreed on, but I, for the longest time, have been convinced that childhood onset gender dysphoria is simply the result, if we're calling it a real diagnosis, it's simply the result of a child. If there's distress, is what I mean, then this child knows that they're different. And maybe they're just picking up on the fact that they're different from other girls or other boys. Or maybe kids are mean and maybe they're being bullied at school, or there's little comments and they feel their difference and people are mean to them. And that's what causes them distress, not this somehow mismatched gender soul that's supposed to be residing within them, but just being different causes distress. And do you disagree, or?
Okay. I disagree, yeah. So there's a couple of thoughts went into my mind there. One is just as an aside, when I was...
Yeah, this will take us nicely into your story. Okay.
For anybody who's heard it all before, you can just fast. Oh, she's going on about that again. But anyway, before I go on about that again, I just want to say as an aside, when I was growing up, there was a boy in my class who was a girlish boy, and I was obviously the tomboy, and we were both quite extreme. And he did grow up to be gay, by the way, and he was very accepted. He was very accepted, but at the same time, I would say it was a bit more derogatory. He was accepted, but yes, I would say, while I was more feared when I was a tomboy. But if you think about it, I was fighting. I was a tomboy. I was aggressive. You know what I mean? And assertive. Tomboys are often very, very assertive and very, very confident. The actual traits of a tomboy are assertive and confident and in your face. The traits of these sissy girls are more holding back, a little bit more timid, a little bit nicer, socializing. So you could see how they would be bullied easier than the tomboy that would whack you. Do you know what I mean? So there is something about that which is kind of interesting. But as well as that, I just tried to think of my own experience, and I tried to do it justice. I really do. I had no idea I was ever going to be talking about this. You know what I mean? So God knows, I hope my memory is accurate. But from what I can remember, I was around about 3. I don't remember it coming into my brain, but certainly from about 3, my sister, my mother, my family, because I was a younger kid, said, it was definitive. I wanted to be a boy, and I was wearing the clothes. I was resisting the clothes of a girl. I was famous for it. I remember Ken Zucker saying, when a kid has it, the town knows. Everybody knows. Yeah. And I was famous for it, infamous for it, you know what I mean? And I was a strange kid, and I remember I had a non-binary imaginary friend. I had an imaginary friend who wasn't a boy or a girl.
Oh, way ahead of your time.
I'm telling you. And I was very definitive about that, And everybody used to ask me, you a boy or a girl? And I'd answer various different answers, but generally no was my answer, which was again a bit non-binary of me. But I wasn't from a happy family. And, my brothers and sisters also developed differences, distress signals in their behavior. You know what I mean? Different ones, nothing to do with gender, but different ones, but they definitely did. And I went towards gender dysphoria. But I was furious. I was misogynist, Mia. hated girls. Their prissy little clothes and their fancy paper and their frills, and oh my God, they made me want to scratch my skin off. I thought were horrible. Women, I thought just vomit making, like, you know what I mean? I like boys and I like men. That's what I wanted to be around. And there was misogyny deep within me. And it was really, really quite old. I was in my teens before I saw girls that I liked, and I thought I could be like that. And they were really cool girls, and I thought, and it opened up a whole, maybe girls are all right. I was misogynist, so I think I was furious. I was a boy. No, I was a girl. I don't know, am I answering your question? What was your question?
Well, the question, it's not, it was more the way I was thinking that the distress comes from being different.
Oh, yeah.
So what would be did you feel, I mean, you say you had dysphoria, so that's an actual like feeling of distress and discomfort that's has an impact on your
am
life.
I being a girl?
So what's the source
Why
of
am I
that? Do you have any idea if it's not feeling different, if it's not bullying, what was the source?
I think I had traits that were probably more, and we could get into this in a minute, what would be associated with men, which could be called masculine, and I still have them. And I think, and I'm only guessing, but I think I thought that the power was with the boys. I think the girls were timid and irritating. And I was like, I'm not on that team. I think that's what it was. So was it the distress of being different? I probably was different. I'm certainly always have been feeling different, but I don't think so. It was so rooted around boys and girls. It was so rooted in like the disdain and contempt I had for girls and everything girlish, pretty. These were insults in my world. Pink, girlish, pretty, all those words were like, ugh. So it didn't feel like different. I was different for lots of different reasons. And I was, I've always felt different. I don't think it was. Not for me. It doesn't resonate with me.
Yeah.
I might be wrong. I'm certainly going to kind of roll it around my mind, but for me, it was rooted in, and that's why I kind of raise my eyebrows when people say there's no such thing. And I'm like, I didn't have a sexual disorder. I didn't have ROGD. I didn't have a contagion. I didn't know any other kid like me. You know what I mean? I did find other kids who were like me, but like I didn't. It was just something that erupted within me. And I just think, can't some children be very perfectionist? Can't some children be very boyish? Can't some children be very girlish? Can't some children be very sporty, some very lazy? Or, you know what I mean? That it was traits within me that combined to a distressing, perhaps clinical level because of the distress in my family. But had it been a less distressed family, might I have just been, a happy little tomboy who we've met loads of them. They ran around, they played on, what's the word? They climbed trees. They're always telling me about, they had a bit of a fun time. I didn't. I was really quite distressed kid.
Yeah.
And I was furious that I wasn't. I was embarrassed that I was a girl. I was mortified that's with this ridiculous group.
And
of whiners.
Without aging, without putting an age on you, what range? DSM. Okay, so the diagnosis existed. The diagnosis was brand new then, and would have.
Well, I was born in 1974, so I was pulling out in 1977.
So you predated the actual diagnosis. Yeah. You really were ahead of your time. But
that's interesting.
Now, excuse me. You did not receive a diagnosis. You made it all the way through childhood. How was that? How did it, do you think you would have benefited from having a diagnosis and receiving care from a mental health professional?
It's a very interesting point because, they say a diagnosis is only, well, according, to Suzanne O'Sullivan, and I love her new book, The Age of Diagnosis, she said, a diagnosis should only be given if it benefits, the person, if it's beneficial. And would it have been beneficial for me to get it? It might have brought a reckoning because I had to have a reckoning. I had to come to a reckoning to myself, which is you are a girl. You've been telling everybody you're a boy. You've been acting in this magical thinking, childish way. You thought you were convincing people you were a boy. And now you've grown up a little bit. You've realised they were pandering to you. They were laughing at you. They were indulging and colluding with you. And now it's mortifying. And you have to walk this back and actually be a girl like you always were. And everybody was just laughing at you. Everybody was older. And I had to come to that realisation.
What
And
age?
it was, puberty was mortifying. It was pre-puberty kind of realising, hang on, I've got myself into something here. And then realising I can't get out. And then realising this shaming. And I think there is a sexual element to it. I know that might be controversial, but I really do. The level of shame and secrecy I had around trying to go back to being a girl was so intense. It makes me think that there was some sort of sexual development was coming out. And it was so private. I wanted to secretly become a girl. Now, I told the whole town that I was a boy. So how I was going to do that, I don't know. But I wanted to do it without anybody noticing. And if anybody ever made a comment, I would immediately revert back into more boyishness for months. Do you follow me? Because
Yeah.
they had exposed my secret. But it took a long, long, long pullback. And I wonder, had I been told, you got an illness? I don't know. I'm not big on diagnoses. I don't like them. I think we're too diagnosis crazy. But would it have, it was a horrible time. It was really, really puberty. It was awful. It was harrowing. It was really, really devastating. And I was so mixed up. What? What? What has just happened? I thought I was a boy, but now I'm a girl. And of course I knew I was a girl. What the hell am I doing? I was, ooh. It was a really complicated, horrible mix of madness. And I remember thinking, this is so hard and I don't know how to get out.
I mean, just that alone, contrast that to the power of social transition. We've all said it so many times, but honestly, like the power of raising, actually, like if your parents had told you, yes, you are a boy, if you'd had he, him pronouns, if they changed your name, and then you get to puberty, you're never going to reverse. It's impossible. If you found it hard enough and you'd just been doing your own thing and nobody was affirming you and and there was no medical option, they were all humoring you maybe. And it was hard enough even for you to just blossom into who you were meant to be. But imagine the child that's had their whole childhood has been a lie, and all of the parents and the teachers and all of the adults in their life have colluded with that lie. How on earth are they ever supposed to reverse course? Even if they have moments of doubt, it's completely impossible. So you see what I'm struggling with. It's hard for me to imagine you getting care that doesn't come with the affirmation or the calling you a trans kid or the danger of giving you a diagnosis that would not have placed you into a dangerous category where medical intervention is possible, because that was already starting to creep in, I suppose. So
Okay, can I come in on that? Because I'm hoping that, as a result of our work, that we're going to have a day where, gender nonconformity is just completely accepted and there is a non-medicalized approach, and it's just the spectre of medicalizing nonconformity leaves us. It just leaves us as an option. Just like we don't look to lobotomies, we don't look to lots of different other treatment options. That it just is not on the table. So that's how I see it. But I don't, but yeah, there's a couple of things. One is, just as an aside for anybody who might be interested, there was a moment when I was young. I'd say I was 8, maybe 9. I think it was 8, maybe 9. And so I was coming into a realization, this has all gone shit. Like, where the fuck what am I doing? Sorry, what am I doing? And a friend of my sister's, she was really tough, and she was the first girl that I saw that I could be. She was really cool, and she was really kind of punky. She was really cool. And it sounds weird. She got me up against the wall. She kind of got me up against the corner, and she kind of had me by the scruff of the neck. And she says, I was you. I was you. You need to watch yourself. You need to watch yourself. You're going to get yourself into the corner and you won't be able to get yourself out. And I was looking at her, maybe I was 10, I don't know what age I was, but I was looking at her and thinking, I am in it. I am in it. I can't get out. I can't get out. But nothing in my face let on. But she was kind of giving me a warning, like, you want to watch this. This is no fun, what you're engaged in. So now I'm going to move into my second point, which is, had it been gender identity disorder, I think I could have really got my head around that. Gender dysphoria, whatever. But had it been gender identity disorder or even identity disorder, arguably it would have been, you know what, your brain has gone off on one. Some people go off on one with OCD. Some people go off on one with anorexia. They get fixated on that idea and they think, I can't rest it easy until I tap the wall 20 times or yeah. And had I been told, you've got fixated on your identity, you've got all kind of fixated and you think this is your real self and all you can do is be that person and all that, it's a glitch and you need to find your way back, you know? And I'm not saying I'm not into treatments for children, but I kind of think, had I got a concept, it would have been fascinating for me because I would have gone, oh, don't forget the chaos of my head. If you told me, what was I in?
Okay, so if I make let's go, like, I would like to make a case for gender identity. Oh no, it's not. It's childhood onset gender dysphoria to be completely removed from DSM-6. If I had my way, that diagnosis would be completely removed from DSM-6 because I think, going back to you already said it. I think it's Suzanne O'Sullivan said it. I've said it many times. It's not, is the diagnosis real? It's not, is the disorder real? It's, is it beneficial? That's very Ian Hacking. Like, you've even multiple personality disorder. He hated it when people asked, is it real? Because it blatantly wasn't real, but it was a real experience for the women. And so he said the much better question to ask is it beneficial? Does it benefit the people receiving the diagnosis? And in the culture in which we live, I do not believe that childhood onset gender dysphoria benefits the children receiving the diagnosis, nor does it benefit society for it to be an official diagnosis, because there's too much danger. Like Jazz Jennings's mother, Jeanette, there's a story, she tells the story of, she pulled DSM-4 off the shelf, right? She searches, so she says, finds gender identity disorder of childhood, diagnoses her son with it, finds him a therapist, and then we all know what happened after that. So the very idea that this is a real psychiatric disorder is too dangerous to be loose in society, is the way I see it. And so, because and I get in trouble for saying this, even from our side, the DSM is a work of fiction. I didn't realize that was a controversial thing to say amongst our people, but apparently it is. But the DSM is largely a work of fiction in that, they're just grouping together symptoms and slapping a label on it and then a billing code, and off we go. You can have that diagnosis. And so, technically, leaving aside schizophrenia, bipolar, the ones that are really truly, obviously, there's some kind of biological issue going on there, you can get rid of any diagnosis in the DSM because none of them are technically real in an objective way. And so I'm all for get rid of it. Can we, what do you think? Can we just childhood onset? In fact, I'll go even further just to finish my point. I would like to take the actual diagnosis of gender dysphoria and get rid of that as well, and subsume it into all of the actual real issues that a person is having that has led them to suffer distress related to their gender. So gender dysphoria would be a symptom of autogynephilia. It would be a symptom of internalized homophobia. It would be a symptom of autism. It could be a symptom of borderline personality. But in and of itself, it's not a primary diagnosis. It's just a symptom of something else going on in your life. That's my wish list. That's what I would like for DSM-6. What do you think?
I have a different wish. I think it's very interesting. I like it. If it happened, I wouldn't be devastated. I'd go, okay, it's my second best choice, but it's workable with.
Okay.
My preference, just in case DSM-6 are listening, you're very welcome. Um, my preference would be that we would bring in a diagnosis along the lines of identity disorder. An identity disorder could be me as a little kid. You got fixated on something, you're a bit stuck in it. You've kind of lost your mind a bit because really when you were very young, you kind of thought you were convinced everybody you were a boy and you kind of lost it. You kind of lost hold of reality on some level. You know what I mean? Then there is RGD kids who have got caught up in a social contagion. And I've met so many of them. They have lost their minds. They've lost their identity. They don't know who they are. And they're fixated on something. Now, is it, the classic gender dysphoria? No, I don't think it's anything like it. I think it's some sort of social contagion. But is it a fixation on identity? Yes, I think they are fixated. Is it social contagion? 100% it is. It doesn't really matter. Anorexia is socially contagious. And so is suicide. There's lots of things that are socially contagious. But it would give a very good way for psychotherapists like myself to work with. It's like, I think you have a disorder. I think it's causing you extraordinary pain. I think you really, really want to be a man or you really, really want to be a woman. And it's a disorder. It's an identity disorder. And I think we should work on it, just like I would with somebody with anorexia or whatever. I think you have something here and I want to work with it, because only going deeper into that disorder, you're going to be utterly miserable. And so then going on to, let's say, an autogynephile or whatever, I think it still fits. And I also think that there's other identities that are arriving, the Therians, the kind of the non-binaries. There's all sorts of identities that are, to me, we're living in an age of identity. And I have a lot to say about why we are, but we are. And as a result, I think identity disorder would really work very well within the clinical context. While if you subsume it into other things, they haven't met them. They just go on and on and on and on about their identity. And I think you would be trying to tell them about internalized homophobia. And what would you be telling the kid? For example, 14-year-old girl, oral GD, obsessed with being a man. All she thinks about, binding, the whole thing, how would you work with that person? Where would you subsume? Maybe you could into anxiety, but it's so identity oriented.
Not being a mental health professional, I don't know, but are you not, like, to me, there's always a reason. There's something going on with that girl. This is when in Lisbon, this is what I was saying in my Lisbon speech, is the gender dysphoria is the beginning of the diagnostic process. So yes, this person is identifying as transgender. The important question is why. And is that not the mental health professional's job? What is it? Is she on the autism spectrum, and is she struggling in her life, and is she isolated, and is she what in her life led her to think that she's a boy? What vulnerability does she have? And we all know that there are a certain number of vulnerabilities in life that can lead you at this point to adopt a label of transgender. Just to me, it seems like the mental health professional's job to find out what's behind the symptom of gender dysphoria. It seems simple, but that's because I've never treated anyone. Is that impossible?
Well, I tell you what I think. When somebody becomes anorexic, they don't become anorexic to begin with. Generally, they're distressed. And then the distress is manifested into what they think is their solution, which is anorexia. The same with alcoholism. You don't start as a 12-year-old alcoholic. You start with the drink, and the drink eases your troubled mind. And then over time you become addicted. And so when, let's say, I treat an alcoholic, it would be, and what happened first? Because once we get rid of the alcoholism, we're going to have the depression, the distress, the troubled mind that led you to the alcoholism. So it would be the very same as gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder or whatever you want to call it. I would say, yeah, at root is distress, but it gets channeled different ways. And I think there could be helpfulness in kind of saying, yeah, I think you have alcoholism. I think that really clears people's minds of, okay, I have to get rid of this problem before I can talk about this problem. I have to get rid of the alcoholism before I can talk about my loneliness or distress. And with, let's say, an identity disorder, I have to calm down about the identity disorder and yield to the fact that I'm powerless, and I need to kind of say, I will not be a boy. And now I have to reconcile myself. I have to have a reckoning. And on some level, there's a deep distress driving this whole crazy venture. Was at root distress. And why does somebody develop OCD? Distress in the first place. It's pretty much always rooted in distress, but it gets channeled different ways. And then it becomes almost a secondary issue. OCD, anorexia, alcoholism, identity disorder. That's how I see it.
It's the idiom of distress. I love that phrase. It's from the DSM, I think. They call it idioms of distress. And that's nice. What you're talking about. It's just the various ways, the pain and the distress and the anxiety, that's all constant. But the idioms of distress constantly are shifting as well in relation to cultural trends and fads. But identity disorder though.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No. I looked up the symptoms of depression, to get diagnosed with depression, and they're so bland, if you follow me. And it's just human suffering. It's when you try to get it into the DSM and categorize it, it just doesn't come off. So the symptoms, you have to have these symptoms: depressed mood, diminished pleasure, fatigue or loss of energy, feeling worthless, diminished cognitive ability, weight loss or weight gain. It's like,
I know. But there's a great story to go with that. Do you know the story of depression? Like Robert Spitzer, he tells this. I don't know if I think it was James Davies, the Unhappy Truth About Psychiatry, I think it's called. He interviews Robert Spitzer about DSM-3 and how they decided on, because I think you have to suffer from those symptoms for 4 weeks. Is that right? For it to be a diagnosis.
Well, it says 2 weeks according to mine, but it's ridiculous. Yeah,
I think it was 4 weeks for DSM-3, and so he asked him, "Why 4? Why not 5? Why not 3?" And the answer was, "Well, we just thought 5 was too many and 3 wasn't enough, and so we all agreed on 4." That is the DSM, which is why I think it's weird that people get upset when I call it a work of fiction. It's just like there was another person on the DSM. I don't know which task force it was, but she said being on those committees is rather like a group of friends deciding on what to have for dinner. And one person wants Indian, another person wants Chinese, and they all settle on going for Italian. That's basically how they're figuring out all of these diagnostic criteria. There's no science to it whatsoever. It's the opinions of the people who happen to be in the room at the time, and they've got no science backing it up. So I don't think you've answered my question about childhood onset gender dysphoria, though. You're making a good point, and I don't hate identity disorder. I think it's pretty good for the adolescents and adults. Does it work for the children? Or
that's so interesting. I don't think it works for a child, but I think it would work for a kid in puberty who was really, because I was at my lowest. That's when I lost it. I could handle it all as a kid, but no, I think actually puberty was when, and that kind of sits well with me because I don't like diagnosing children early anyway. You know what I mean? So, therefore, it wouldn't be childhood onset. But you see, don't forget that kid would be saying, "I've had this all my life, as far as back as my mind." I'd say 3, but it's as far as back as my mind goes. You know what I mean? It doesn't. I don't have a time, and I remember I was happy with being a girl. So, yeah, I think we're falling somewhere similar, that puberty would be the onset, would be the deep distress, would be where I was really not in a good place. I was really not in a good place. But can I just talk about something before, because I'm conscious at the time, we got a lot in. Unless you want to add something else on, I want to talk about the word gender in this episode, if we could.
Can I just compare DSM-4 and DSM-5, because I wanted to.
Why not?
This comes from, I think it was Erin Reed, that guy, and he did like this crazy fact check of WPATH files. Like within 24 hours of WPATH files, he like discredited all my 7 months of work. And one part of it was he was really upset about my referencing the desistance literature, and so trans activists love this argument, and this is why I just think throw it all away. It's too dangerous to have in the hands of the trans activists right now. And so DSM-4, the childhood onset, it was gender identity disorder of childhood, and it was Susan Bradley and Ken Zucker were on the committee, and they didn't, like, they had all the criteria were the same, but it was not essential that a child insist they're a member of the opposite sex, or it was not essential that a child desperately want to be a member of the opposite sex. It was there, but it wasn't essential. And then in DSM-5, the only real difference is they made that an essential criterion. The child must, it's not just gender nonconformity, it's the child has to insist that they are a member of the opposite sex. That is how they supposedly discredit all of the desistance literature from before, because all of that literature took place when the child didn't have to insist that they were a member of the opposite sex. And so I want it gone, because there's the whole hardcore activist framing of it, and this diagnosis can be used in such a way that it can reinforce the concept of the transgender child. But it's also something that those activists fail to understand, which blows my mind, is in the Zucker era, in the desistance era, nobody was socially transitioning kids and nobody was lying to children. Schools weren't teaching children that it's possible to be a girl with a penis or a boy with a vagina. Schools weren't teaching all of this nonsense with I am jazz and everything. And yet, and in the DSM-5 era, they were. And so it stands to reason that a whole bunch of these childhood onset kids who really experience the distress that you felt, it makes perfect sense that they're all insisting that they are members of the opposite sex, because they're growing up in a mad moment in history that literally tells them they are members of the opposite sex. And so I don't know that we're going to move on from this crazy moment anytime soon. I would love to just wave a magic wand, eradicate the entire concept of the transgender child, get rid of the I Am Jazz books and the crazy materials that are in schools. I would love to wave a magic wand and it happen right at this moment, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. We're going to spend so long ridding society of this poisonous lie. And therefore, while we live in this culture, I just think this diagnosis is far too dangerous and can be used by, these activists or parents like Jazz Jennings' mother, and therefore DSM-6 should get rid of it. Are you with me?
No, because I don't think it's a good idea to be reactive to mad people. I think you've got to lead. I think you've got to keep your head around you when all others are losing theirs. And they can be as mad as they want, but our job is to look at what's actually going on and to show a way forward that actually is a healthy approach. And it's like, let them off. They're going to be as mad can be. We have to show an accurate, and by the way, just on that point, we have to show accuracy and we have to show a path forward of what is the best and best way forward. I don't like Susanna Sullivan and whoever else who are saying a diagnosis, it's irrelevant unless it's helpful, because I don't like working on the subjectivity of if it's helpful. Well, it might be helpful for somebody who isn't remotely suffering from that to be called depressed, because helpful, it's too nebulous. I think it's awful. I think there actually should be some sort of criteria, and otherwise it should be traits of depression, traits of identity. Do you follow me? I just think this idea that you can get stamped because it's helpful is a car crash of an idea. Don't like it, even though I use it. But I'm like, God, that is way too subjective. Some doctor could say it's helpful because, it's helpful to get a diagnosis of dyslexia so that you get resources.
Yeah. Can I feel I have to defend myself a little bit here, though. Back to the first point. It's not only because of what the activists do with it. I also think the diagnosis never should have been in the DSM ever. I think it should not have entered DSM-3. It should never have been in DSM-4. It just should never have existed. Because, like I said at the beginning, the origin of it, They only created this
Oh yeah.
diagnosis because a bunch of autogynephilic men were lying to get on hormones and surgeries. So then they turned their attention to these gender non-conforming little boys, these effeminate little boys who will have always existed throughout history, and they never had a psychiatric disorder, and they didn't need a diagnosis. It only appeared and became an issue because of the trans movement. I don't think it's ever actually been a diagnosis.
Yeah, you're yeah, it's thought provoking. I do want to point out I did interview Ken Zucker and Susan Bradley just quite recently about the 1970s and their work. Susan in the 1970s and later Ken. And, there has consistently been, frankly, homophobic parents with boys saying, sort this kid out. And they were not prompted by autogynephiles anywhere. They were like, this kid is wearing a dress. He's mortifying us. Fix
Oh,
him.
yeah.
So, yeah. So
Well, but
they
I mean,
were
that's
always
where the
there.
diagnosis came from. But yeah, sure, the homophobia will have always existed. But as a diagnosis, it wasn't a diagnosis until they pathologized it and then they got it into the DSM. To me, it's not really, though, that I do understand that there is such, you experienced it. I can't sit here and say there's no such thing as childhood onset gender dysphoria when I'm talking to someone who experienced it. I'm just saying all kinds of experiences exist, and we don't
Yeah.
need to put them into a diagnostic category and then give this label to all of these children. Is it not, maybe it's harsh, but is it not better to muddle through the way you did rather than be diagnosed and be defined by that diagnosis and then add in all the madness of the culture in which we live that can send you down a very destructive path?
Could be. I'm very open to that. I might not have benefited at all from some sort of identity disorder diagnosis. I'm not stuck on that, but I prefer my own theory, which is identity disorder makes sense of a fixation on identity, just like eating disorder makes sense of a
In
fixation on eating.
adolescence, sure.
Yeah.
I don't hate that idea. I kind of like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just say a little bit about gender, because a lot of people will have been whacking their heads off the wall for the whole hour because we've been using words around gender without dismissing it. I'm very aware that we are born male or female. I'm very aware, large gametes and all this. And I know an awful lot of people are saying that gender doesn't exist, and I don't buy it. I do think that, for example, does gender have a role? Is it just a social construct? I'm not convinced it is, because I'm like, if you're born female, then you might take on certain personalities so as to attract evolutionarily a mate, if you follow me. So you could be more feminine. And there's certain traits that are more associated with being female. For example, connecting, or being more verbal, or being more yielding, for want of a better word. Let me be more emotionally expressive. The girls are more likely to play with dolls. The boys are more likely to play with trucks, things versus people. Boys prefer, and Carol Hooven's book on testosterone is amazing. Boys prefer, rough and tumble play. There's surges of testosterone at 3 and at 8 and all this. Boys are more physically aggressive. In my own experience, I enjoyed the physical aggression of boys as a kid, and I have abhorred the relational aggression of women in my adulthood. I've been a real target of it, and it's drove me mad. So, girls are more likely to say, let's all go together. And men and boys, or males, are more likely to, be more assertive or dominant. Men are more likely to be sociosexual, as in they want more partners. These are traits that are very well established, and I would call them gender, like that they are the kind of, so male and female is sex, and masculine and feminine is gender. And I'm completely cool with that. And I don't understand how many people want to rip my head off for saying there's such thing as masculinity and femininity.
Yeah,
As a
I can.
woman.
I mean, I can't disagree with anything you just said. I agree completely. But then I've been accused of being a trad wife for staying home with my children. I remember once being told that I couldn't call myself a TERF because I wear makeup, because they were taking the literal definition, radical feminist, therefore you can't. So we, in an interview that has yet to be released, at the risk of repeating myself, but I was talking about this in the last interview we recorded with Diana Fleischman, that in my woke days, embarrassing, I had a whole group of mum friends, and we, between us, had many, many, many children, and we would meet at the park. And one day we all met, and our kids got together, the boys separated off, they picked up sticks and they're fighting over in one corner, and then the girls are sat in the stand drawing and stuff and chatting. And I just remarked, this happens every single time we meet. And bear in mind, these are like the woke parents raising genderless children, and they're like, there's no stereotypical anything, that they would never put their girl in a dress, God forbid. And so these are raising gender neutral children, and the boys are over there with sticks and the girls are over there playing in the sand. And I just observed it. I just made a comment, look, they always separate in this way. And honestly, it was like I'd announced that I was going to get a swastika tattooed on my forehead or something. The horror on their faces was, how could you even say that? That's completely forbidden to observe one of the most obvious facts about human existence, that boys and girls are different and men and women are different. And I don't know, is it feminism that we're all supposed to be like women there's no difference, because if there's difference, then that's how women are oppressed, and so we all have to pretend that men and women are the same, and therefore there's no such thing as gender. I think that's where it came from, and it's obviously nonsense.
Well, yeah, totally. I agree with you. It's funny, the first time I ever met Kelly J. Keane, I was doing my film in 2018. And anyway, she told me that she first came to prominence in something like 2010 because she was in an article in the Sunday Times about gender neutral parenting. Crazy little tip. And I don't even know whether she was pro or she was laughing about it at the time.
Surely she was opposed.
I'd say I don't think so. I think she's going on a journey.
Well, and that's fine. I like people going on journeys. I used to be woke. I talk about it like it's I've changed a lot.
No, I don't say that. I don't say that with any edge, but I do say that with gender neutral parenting was a big thing. Yeah, you know what I mean? It was a big thing that people were really into. But I wasn't. It was so funny because I'd had my own experiences. I was raising my girl to be a girl and my boy to be a boy. But yeah, I just wanted to put that out there about gender, because I'm finding it incredibly weird when people say there's no such thing as gender, there's no such thing as gender dysphoria. And I'm like, what are all these kids experiencing? They're experiencing something. And you're saying it's a symptom, and I'm saying, yeah, maybe it could be a better phrased disorder of the mind.
True. And you need precise language. Like I went through this with a group recently where I wrote a document, and then everybody's contributing different suggestions and everything. And I think when you're so in the weeds and you're so obsessed with the issue, you forget that there are normal people who don't live and breathe this. And so, yes, we may hate the word gender and replace it with God knows what, but to the average person, you still need to be able to communicate with normal people if that's your goal of reaching normal people. And therefore, using the word gender, we all know gender means masculinity, femininity, and therefore normal people will understand what we're talking about. And I think you have to speak in a way to reach the normal people out there, because otherwise you're just preaching to the choir, and what's the point of that? But as for gender dysphoria, I think it is a real experience, no question, but I don't think that it deserves a primary diagnosis in the DSM. Or I will end on this though. Alan Francis gave me this idea. I never got to talk to him about it. I did want to talk to him about it, but things went pear-shaped. He says that he came up with an idea, and it wasn't for obviously gender dysphoria, but in the DSM he suggested putting black box warnings on dangerous diagnoses that are subject to epidemics and fads. And there's I think that like an FDA black box warning, but in the DSM. So if DSM-6 wants to keep gender identity disorder of childhood or gender dysphoria, whatever, put a black box warning on it so that everyone knows that there is a cultural fad going on and there is rampant overdiagnosis, there is social contagion. With the kids, there is this untethering kids. Like, put the warning on there that this is a dangerous diagnosis, and if you really must apply it, you need to apply it with great caution in order not to do terrible harm to the person.
I think you'll leave it at that, Mia. Thank you.
Thank you.